What is leather? Leather is plastic. Leather is plastic because of two things. One is embossing, and the other is pigmentation. So embossing is a process where leather is basically stamped with a coat of plastic, or just stamped to make look a certain way. You don't really want embossed leather because usually that uses the worst parts of leather. This, for example, is embossed leather. So you see it's got a ton of creases right here that are kind of not really that easy to do much with. And if you look up close, you see that there's a grain there that's not a real grain. That is a grain from a machine that basically just puts a ton of plastic on there. It's not really good quality. When you bend it, it doesn't show the pores getting lighter from the oil seeping to the top. So this is not a good type of leather. Now, the only general use for embossed leather like this is for if you want to look a certain way, or if you want to be in your car or just on a sofa or something that you generally don't want to get messy, because a lot of stuff uses embossed leather, which is pretty much the trash of the leather world. When leather is cut and machined, what happens is there's a top portion of the leather and there's a bottom portion of the leather. The top portion of the leather is the good stuff. You want that. The bottom of the portion of the leather is not really that good, and it's not as tough as the top. Leather is thick, so you don't want to have the entire part of the leather because it can be pretty big and you're not going to be able to carry that around in the wallet. So basically what they do is they slice it in half. The top stays and the bottom would go to the garbage can, except if it wasn't for embossed leather. So basically turns out looking something like this piece of scrap that I made into sort of a glove. So this is what's called suede leather right here. So suede leather is that bottom piece of leather. You don't really want to use this for sorts of gloves and stuff. It's not really that high quality. It's not really going to last that long. It stretches easily. All the fibers on the inside are very loose. So if it gets scraped or whatnot over time, it just wears out very quickly. And that goes on to embossed leather right here. That's also a suede leather on the bottom and a piece of plastic on the top. And this is usually what's called genuine leather. This is where the term genuine leather comes from. Genuine leather does not mean real leather. I mean, it does. It does mean real leather. But most of the time when you hear the term genuine leather, that means that it is technically real leather because they did use the bottom portion of leather, but it's not really because of the top. So one thing that companies actually do is it's not very common, it's a newer thing that they're doing, is that they actually turn leather into a paste. They'll grind it up into a paste and then they'll spray it onto a boot or something like that. And then you can call that real leather when it's completely not. The boot could be made out of some weird canvas, it can be made out of plastic, it could be made out of just generally anything, and as long as something has leather on it, you can say that it is made of leather, no matter how little the amount of leather that there is, because there is no regulation on what is leather and what is not. Just as long as it has something, you're good. So the second thing that makes leather plastic is a process called pigmentation. Pigmentation is when you dye things, pretty much, but it's a little bit more complicated because a lot of misinformation exists within the leather world. So to start off, there's something called aniline leather. So pure aniline leather is leather that hasn't been worked, that doesn't have a finish. It's just oiled and boom, you're done. No dye, no finish, no nothing. Pure aniline leather is that. So, and then you can go into aniline leather, which is leather that has been dyed, but it doesn't have a finish on it. Then you go into semi-aniline leather, which has a slight finish on it, but the pores are covered just a little bit, but not too much. And then finally you go on to fully pigmented leather. Fully pigmented leather means that the leather's pores are completely covered. The pores can't breathe. It's just leather that's fully covered with plastic. So you'll take a good piece of leather like this, and if you just cover it with plastic, that's how you pigment it. It gives a better quality leather than genuine leather like this, because it does still have that top fiber that's in this leather right here. So you can actually see that this does have a top portion to it right here, and has a bottom right there. So there's a top and there's the bottom, and this is the thick grains of leather right there that are very they're very strongly intertwined. So the thing to stay away from usually is genuine leather. This is just plastic. It's not leather, sort of. This is leather, but it's the bad part of leather. You don't want this. And then pigmented leather, which is not as bad. You see it in high fashion dress shoes and whatnot. You know, dress shoes will be generally black, and they'll have a very noticeable fake grain on it. It might be embossed, but it won't have this layer of plastic. So there's also different ways to tan leather. So the two most common ways is vegetable tanning and chrome excel tanning. Chrome excel tanning is basically using a bunch of chemicals to get the leather a certain way, and then oil tanning or vegetable tanning is when you just use natural vegetable oils and whatnot to get it look a certain way. So it'll look sort of like this, and the finished product can look like this, that sort of color. So a chrome excel looks something like this. You can see this is a piece of suede that I was just talking about. You can see there is a large amount of bluing in the leather, and that's from all the chemicals that come from chrome excel tanning. So if you see that sort of stuff in the leather, it's most likely chrome excel tan. Chrome excel tanning is much faster than oil tanning, or is much faster than the vegetable tanning, because vegetable tanning takes a very long time. Since you're not using chemicals, you're just using real vegetable oil. Leather, when it's machined, it's split into different segments. There's usually a top grain and a bottom grain. The bottom grain is the bad stuff. You don't want to get that. It's much looser, it's much more stretchy and movable. The fibers are much more loose, and the top grain, the fibers are much more tight, so it's a much harder layer. This is what goes on the outside of the cow's skin. So this bottom grain is called suede, genuine leather. You generally hear suede or genuine leather or splits. When you split a leather, there's the splits, and then there's the top portion of the leather. In the top portion of the leather, there's a few different ways that you could make it and machine it. After they split the leather in half, what you get is a top portion and the split. So then this top portion that hasn't had anything done to it yet is called full grain leather, because it has the whole grain that's on top, it has the whole middle grain, and it has a little bit of the bottom grain. So that's called full grain leather. People generally associate full grain leather with quality. If it's not full grain, it has to be lower quality, but generally a top grain leather and a full grain leather are both similar, are both just different, I would say. They have different properties, they're used differently. Full grain leather is much more hard than top grain leather. So after you split the leather, there's two different kinds of leather. There's a full grain leather, and then there's a top grain leather. This is another thing that's kind of misleading, because it's not the top of the grain, it's kind of the middle part. There's a lot of very confusing and misleading things in the leather world, like how aniline something is. People think that semi-aniline means aniline, and aniline means pure aniline, and pigmented leather doesn't exist. It's very confusing. So there's the full grain, and then there's the top grain. The top grain is more like the middle section of the leather. Top grain leather is not as hard as full grain leather, and that is generally good for making wallets and other sorts of things, but generally bags and more heavy duty needs do require, or it is a good thing to have, full grain leather to go with it. So There's also two other things, which is bonded leather and also the paste. Bonded leather just means that it's just scraps of leather that are just all glued together. You don't want that. Stay away from that. Anything's better than bonded leather. Something that you'll hear a lot of the time is gloved leather. Now, this is kind of a weird area because there's something called Napa leather, which is a way to refine the leather in a certain way that it becomes much more soft. But a lot of times people don't know what they're saying, and they say glove leather when they just mean genuine leather or splits. So it is very confusing, because glove leather would be, someone considers something like this, because it's very, you can bend it easily, and then this, you can't really bend it more than like this. So this is going to be horrible for a glove, but this is really good quality leather by comparison to something to this, or you can just bend it like that very easily. Another thing you hear about leather is that leather is not good because animals have to die for leather. This is not necessarily true, because they don't die for the leather, they die for meat. It is very rare for animals to die directly for the hide or for their leather, because most of the time we want the meat. So what ends up happening is that the meat gets taken out of the animal and it gets used, but then where does that hide go? Because we're still gonna kill the animals, but we're gonna try to use as much of the animal as possible. If we don't end up using the animal, where do their parts go? So the hide and the leather, if it's not used, what ends up happening is that it goes into a landfill, which is just not good, and it just ends up catering more to. Another thing that you hear is vegan leather. Vegan leather also isn't really good for the environment, because vegan leather is essentially like this genuine leather piece here, except the bottom isn't real leather, it's just synthetic, but it's just a big piece of plastic that it's obviously plastic is just awful for the environment. So if you get something that's vegan leather, you might be catering to cows or whatnot, but you're gonna end up harming the environment more than if you just bought an actual leather, because leather is a byproduct. Lastly, I'll talk about how companies end up cheating you. So a lot of companies, they do use genuine leather. A lot of high-end companies use genuine leather, or they use embossed leather. They use heavy pigmented leather that isn't natural like this, because heavy pigmented leather and genuine leather have properties that allow it to get stained, that allow it to get, you could do anything with this. I could spill a bunch of water on this and it'll look the same. So I could just spray ketchup on it and it'll be completely fine. And that is an upside, but it's also a much cheaper product. This is much cheaper than this. So what ends up happening is that these high-end companies are using cheaper products to make expensive stuff. So like you'll see stuff like Gucci or Louis Vuitton or any high-end brand that you can think of usually uses genuine leather. So what they do is they use this genuine leather and then they upsell it to be incredibly expensive. So another thing that you got to be aware about is a made in Italy tag. Now this does seem appealing because it is made in somewhere other than China or like a third world country and whatnot, but a lot of times high-end companies, what they do is they actually ship people from these poorer countries into Italy to pay them lower than people that actually live in those countries. So they'll ship people to Italy and then pay them what they would get for their third world country pay, like if they lived in China, they'll pay them the Chinese rates or whatever the rates of their country are to get paid for that work, and they won't get paid for what it is to made in Italy. So when you buy from high-end companies, you're essentially buying cheap products made from cheap pay. So yeah, a lot of times you don't know what is real leather, what is fake leather, because these companies don't tell you. They don't tell you what type of leather that is. An easy way to see what type of leather it is genuine leather. That's always an obvious one. If something says genuine leather, it's this. It's the cheap, fake plastic leather. Even leather workers don't know what makes type of leather high quality, because there is just so much misinformation out there. It's really hard to get this stuff, and I mean, I can't blame them because there's just so much misinformation. Okay, so for my favorite part, let's look at some companies online who sell leather goods and whatnot. So, shop gifts for women. This catches my eye. $420 for... What do you think this looks like? Definitely genuine leather. Like, there's no other way around it. This is not real leather. This is just plastic. So, what I like to do is I like to figure out what the material value of something is, and I like to think about the labor that it takes. That way you figure out the value for the total of it. So, like the form. An engine is pretty expensive, but if you just consider the material value of an engine, it's probably gonna be like $50. If you want an engine for a car, you're not gonna pay $50. You're gonna pay like $600 to $1,000. So this is $420 for a hunk of plastic. This, I would say, the actual leather and the zipper and this piece here and the material for the snap, this is probably gonna cost about $1. I will say, to be completely open and honest, the leather that I use is the top grain. It's pretty high quality leather. It's real leather. You know, I get it from a tannery. I have my ways around for getting it cheap. But you know, I'm not paying that much for the actual leather. Like leather is a pretty cheap commodity. It's not that expensive. If you want real leather, you can find it for cheap. If you look around and do your research well, you can find it for really, really cheap. So each of the wallets that I make cost about maybe like $4 to $8. The finish, the leather, the oil, the snaps. That if I'm buying like the highest quality stuff that I possibly can, and it costs me less than $10, like this, like obviously the stuff that I use isn't gonna be 100% the greatest quality leather that you ever can find, because I don't want to buy the greatest quality leather, because then it's going to be super expensive. That's going to cost like $100 for a square foot of leather. So then after that, there is what comes into the form. How do you make it? Well, so a lot of this stuff is machine stitched. So you can sort of see the stitch lines. They kind of make it so you can't, because they're using black leather on black thread. So there's the stitches there, and it's quite obvious that it's a machine stitch. So there's a huge difference between machine stitching and hand stitching, and it's that machine stitching is considerably less strong than hand stitching. Because if you've ever taken off like a thread off of your shirt and then you pull on it, it just keeps going and going and going. You can just keep pulling on that thread of your shirt. That's pretty much the stitching that we have for this sort of wallet right here. But if you hand stitch a good, then it lasts a considerably longer amount of time, because if you pull on the thread, the rest of it doesn't come out. But like a lot of wallets similar quality to this sell for like $5. You're paying $410 for nothing that's just going nowhere. Maybe you're buying the name, but you're buying the name of a company that's stealing money from you. So I don't know why you'd want to form. When you think about it, it can't take more than like $3 to like make this thing, to pay some sort of low minimum wage third world country person to make a wallet like this. Materials and form, I mean, maybe you can take into account this G in the zipper. The form of that would be a little bit more expensive, and the snap, those will also be a little bit more expensive. So maybe like $3 to make it, $4 to make it. So in total, you're looking at $5 to $6 to make it. And this is like overestimating. Like companies can make this stuff for incredibly cheap. I don't even know how cheap, but like you see stuff like this selling for like $5 or less. So you're basically throwing away $440. Just also look at the description of this, because this will give you a good outlook onto the grain structure. I feel like I can see it repeat. They don't say anything about the leather. It says materials and care, and then here it says black leather. Well, what leather is it? How aniline is it? Where do you get the leather? You know, it's just black leather. I don't know what that means. G hardware is reimagined into tonal resin. The accessory monochrome shades add a contemporary feel to the emblematic design. Double G hardware is reimagined in tonal resin. That's just gobbledygook for this is plastic. So yeah, don't trust this made in Italy tag. A lot of high-end brands say that their stuff is made in Italy. They ship Chinese workers to places like that. Oil and leather, when you bend it over and over again, the pores, the oil goes to the surface of the pores. And then over time, what happens is it creates a patina, and it actually looks really, really, really nice.